Welcome back on the AM show. We get right into our big stories. And this morning, the next meal, and of course, that could pose a danger to Africa's democracy. But we ask, what have African leaders got to do with it? We're going to explore the various dimensions to Africa's leadership deficit for a continent that seems to appreciate its own quandary, but its leaders are unable to walk the talk. This morning, our crack panel is here to deal with these vexed matters. We'll be bringing you details on that. As I introduce my guests joining the conversation, we have Professor Kwesi Enning. Of course, he delivers bespoke services on security. We also have Dr. John Osai Kwapong. He's right here in the studio with me. And as time goes on, we'll also have Nanaya Mreku, who speaks on international matters. All of them joining the conversation. But first, let me say a very good morning to you, Dr. Osai Kwapong. Good morning to you. All right. We also have Professor Kwesi Enning. Professor Enning, a very good morning to you, sir. You would have to unmute, sir. All right, I see Prof trying to unmute. I also have...
On this technology for the senior citizens.
Which is why I paused and I laughed a bit. Thank you for joining. Dr. Kwabena Arthur Kennedy joins the conversation. Doc, good morning to you.
Good morning to you and to your viewers.
I love your tie. Thank you for joining the conversation. But
thank you.
Right before we get into the conversation, gentlemen, let me just take you a bit by surprise. Even as we talk about democracy and where we are going, I would like to look at a topical issue that has come to the fore. Oliver Barker-Vormawor. He has made certain claims. Of course, he of the Democracy Hub has made certain claims about members of parliament on the vetting committee taking sums of money to approve certain candidates. And of course, today he will appear before Parliament. But I want your quick take on that. Before we get into that, let's listen to the Boku Central Member of Parliament, Mahama Yariga, who is also the incoming majority leader, on what he had to share on this matter.
In terms of protecting your integrity is sometimes even more important than the substance of what you do, because, like I indicated, you will go very far if you are perceived to have integrity. And so for me, spending time to really erase all doubts regarding your integrity is very important. I had wind of what he said, and then the chairman reached out. I said, call him, let him come, and if he has anything and he can substantiate it, we need to deal with it openly and then transparently. So I think that inviting him to come and substantiate his claims is in the right direction.
At least you spent some few days on the committee. What personal knowledge or otherwise do you have to share on these claims being made, that some monies were paid to members of the committee to approve some of the nominees?
I'm unaware of any such thing. And so that's why I think he should come. Maybe he has something, maybe, because you see, in this country, all sort of things happen. All sort of things happen. I actually met somebody who operates in a sector, and the person said, oh, our minister is, our sector minister is being considered this week, so we want to go and help him. And I said, has your sector minister asked you to come and help him? So no, we just want to come together and help him. I said,
real story.
Yeah, real story. I said, no, none of them has a problem. All of them, so far as we are concerned, if the president has nominated them, unless somebody really has a petition that is against your sector minister nominee, he should be fine. I'm telling you, I swear.
Right.
I swear. I told the person, I don't think there's a need for you and people in your sector to go mobilizing money that you are going to help your minister, because we won't even accept it. So that is out there. You get the situation.
Right.
A certain perception that, and so maybe somebody...
So that is Mahama Yariga. Gentlemen, I want your quick thoughts on this development, especially as this is not the first time some such accusation has come up. If you recall, Okudzeto Ablakwa walked away from one such committee on the back of such a claim in the previous vetting. But let me come to you first, Dr. Arthur Kennedy. What are your reflections on this?
Yeah, I think that if you keep seeing coming from a house, after you are entitled to believe that there is a fire. As you just rightly pointed out, this is not the first time this has been said. Long ago, now Speaker Babin once said there's corruption in Parliament. In addition to that, I remember Manasseh Azuri Awuni's book, The President We Didn't Have. He made allegations on the record based on his interviews that this thing happens from the previous staff. And we know that who wanted to remove Ken Ofori-Atta, MP, remove somebody who worked on the parliament with money, and nobody was able to find out what happened. So it appears, looking at all this circumstantial evidence, that something like that happens. And this come and submit proof is actually very interesting. It's the same thing that the judiciary used to say till Anas release showing that our judges were taking money and goods and maidens in exchange for judgments. There are some of these things that are true, and when they say come and prove it, and of course everybody denies it, it doesn't mean that it is not true. I think that we should deal with the problem rather than look for scapegoats.
Is part of dealing with the problem hauling Oliver Barker-Vormawor before Parliament?
That is part of it, but also part of it is also, for example, if you look at Manasseh Azuri Awuni's book, he had people on talking about that. Part of it might be summoning the previous chief of staff who was allegedly quoted in the book to have admitted on the record that this happens. Part of it is finding out who in the MPP, for example, walked onto the floor of Parliament with money to try and influence MP who wanted Ken Ofori-Atta removed. I think this is not just an incident, it is a broad culture that must be tackled.
All right. Let me go to Professor Kwesi Enning. What are your reflections on this?
Well, I think this is an issue that needs to be tackled head on because the perception is out there. And I think, as Mahatma Ayariga says, if people decide to come help a minister designate, it means those people believe it is an accepted practice, and therefore they want to do so. And people within Parliament who have worked with Parliament have all made comments, or some people have made comments and statements alluding to that fact. So I think this is much bigger than an individual. After the appearance today, I think it would be useful for Parliament itself to establish some committee to get to the bottom of this, with the powers of a high court or whatever, because we need to do a different type of politics away from the next meal politics that we are coming to talk about. This touches the very core of our democratic practice, levels of trust, issues around integrity, and also issues around respect and citizens' participation in that democratic process, that it must be fair, transparent, and doing good to all manner of people. So this goes beyond this gentleman, and I'm hoping Parliament will be bold enough to ask for a much wider investigation into the frequency or otherwise of such occurrences.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. Let me also come to Dr. John Osai Kwapong on this self-same matter. Brief thoughts on it?
I'll just re-echo what Professor Enning and Dr. Arthur Kennedy has said. It's a worrying issue, especially if you reflect on sentiments that Ghanaians have expressed in the Afrobarometer survey about declining trust in the institution of parliament, as well as increasing perceptions of corruption. Such matters go further to chip at an institution that is already not viewed very positively in some of the sentiments that Ghanaians have expressed. So hopefully, and again, this is not the first time that this is coming up. So whatever Mr. Oliver knows and can share, hopefully it would come to light, and hopefully Parliament as an institution would take it seriously. Because I think the last time that this came up, after an investigation, nothing was found. It was, yes, it was described as, you know, there was nothing to that, that allegation. So it's something that I think Parliament as an institution should take very seriously.
All right. Nanayo Amreku, thank you for joining the conversation.
Thank you.
Of course, Nanayo Amreku speaks on international affairs. He's an analyst, and he joins us in the studio, especially as we segue into the next belt of the conversation. And we're going to be focusing on that keynote address delivered by former Vice President Dr. Mahmoud Bawumia in Nigeria recently. This was specifically on Monday. It was a national conference on strengthening democracy in Nigeria. What are some of the highlights of that? We'll share that with you currently before we get into the conversation proper with our guests. I'd like you to watch this.
A politician's ambition must, and I repeat, must never supersede the interest of your nation. Ambition can always be seen for a politician in two dimensions. You have a personal ambition, but you also have an ambition for your country. Most of the time, when we talk of ambition, we are only talking about personal ambition. The ambition for the country is relegated. We don't talk about ambition. When you ask somebody what is your ambition, it's usually coming up about personal ambition. But for a politician, you face these two dimensions of ambition. The ambition for yourself and the ambition for your country. For democracy to survive and to thrive and to be strengthened, the ambition for the country must be paramount and must supersede the ambition for yourself. One of the biggest threats to democracy today is what I call the next meal principle. Before I make my point, I need to re-echo the words of one of Africa's greatest sons, the distinguished Nelson Mandela, who said that as long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality exist in our world, none of us can truly rest, end quote. Democracy must be a means to an end. The best democracy is the one that delivers public goods and services effectively and efficiently and creates opportunities for citizens whilst making conscious efforts to leave no one behind. For sub-Saharan Africa, the data suggests that we do not have an option to do nothing. In 2024, the World Bank estimated that 2/3 of the world's population live in extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. Back home here, the World Bank's 2024 review reveals that more than half of Nigerians live in multidimensional poverty. For Nigeria, and indeed much of sub-Saharan Africa, our work is cut out for us. We need to take decisive actions to demonstrate that to govern is to advance the interests and welfare of the people. We need to reconfigure our economic systems, processes, and institutions in a manner that prioritizes the next meal for the majority of our people. For far too long, the focus has been on ticking the boxes on democratic institutions, much to the neglect of what those institutions have been able to produce for the ordinary citizen. Between 2020 and 2023, there have been about 8 coups d'etats in Africa. A few leaders have also changed or are changing their constitutions to allow them to stay in power beyond their constitutionally mandated terms. The increasing fragility of democracy in Africa and across the world is cause for concern. In democratic countries, the will of the people is expressed through elections, and leaders, especially incumbents, must trust the electoral process and accept the will of the people for the survival of democracy.
And that is the former vice president giving us, making cogent analysis of some of the ills in Africa when it comes to our democracy. He says the politicians' ambition shouldn't supersede ambition of the country, and that there is the next meal situation, one of the biggest threats to Africa's democracy. We're going to unpack these this morning. Let me bring in Nana Yao for starters. You've not had a bite of the conversation yet. Quick reaction, first off, to what you thought, what you felt initially when you heard this from our former vice president.
Well, good morning to your viewers out there, and thank you for having me once again. I think it's the first thing that comes to mind as well. It's good for the global image of Ghana, because you had a president, a presidential candidate that lost the election and conceded, and in that capacity, he has built some reputation for himself, and he has the opportunity to speak during such forums. I think the current president, who was then the former president, also had such opportunities to be on international platforms. So I think that it's good for the global image of Ghana, especially when it comes to democracy, as one of the successful stories, quote unquote, in democratic credentials. It's once again put us out there. But then again, it also tells us why politicians have beautiful ideas when they are in opposition, but when they come to power, the story turns into a different ball game altogether. So I think we need to understand. For me, the interest has always been, why do they have a lot of what I call programmatic politics? All the beautiful ideas when they are in opposition, and then when they are in power, do they do something different, entirely different? But importantly to what he's saying is the next meal syndrome, right? I've always said that democracy means nothing to a hungry man, or democracy does not run on an empty stomach. So once people are not feeling what has been termed democratic dividends, right? They are not feeling the practice of democracy is not reflecting in their livelihoods for a better kind of lifestyle or a standard of living, then they are likely to cling on to other forms of government. They are likely to toy with it. They are likely to experiment with other forms of...
To lose their appreciation for
democracy. So that is one point. And then to lose the appreciation of democratic practices, the institutions therein. So I think that is a very important issue that we can begin to look at, the next meal syndrome. It's a part on the politicians as well as a part on the electorate. I keep saying that sometimes we have bad leaders because sometimes we have bad voters. So I think it's a two-way sword. What happens to the leaders that come into power, and then what is the mindset of the electorate? Because at the end of the day, they are the ones that go to the polls to elect their leaders. So I think it's a two-way stream that we can begin to look at it. Let's take the leaders. What informs their decision when they are in power? And how is the electorate also positioned to the extent that, do they appreciate the democratic practices? Or at the end of the day, it's just bread and butter issues that inform their decision as to how to vote. So I think this is what I see as the first point of discussion before going on to other issues.
For you, Professor Enning, ab initio, the signaling, the message, what do you make of it? We'll get into the details, but I want your initial reflections on what you made of it coming from our former vice president.
Well, I mean, my first thought was, where were all these great ideas when you were in power? Leaders tend, or the eye blinds tend to fall off when leaders lose power and they can see things much clearly. And I think that is what we are seeing now. And probably we started, or Dr. Bawumia started seeing things much more clearly when he conceded that defeat in a very statesman-like manner, which we all appreciate. So I think we are seeing a new Dr. Bawumia, increasingly politically mature and suave and being his own person. But he says a couple of interesting things, but then raises much more questions whether this is an epiphany post-December 7th, which would then be very interesting. And that would then allow us to excuse him for some of the things that happened whilst he was in power. But if this is a new epiphany post December 7th, then I welcome the thoughts that we can engage on some of the very crucial things that he has said.
All right. Dr. Kennedy.
Yes, I think it was a very good speech. Very well written, very well delivered. But watching it means that, to begin with, I don't know whether Nigerians seeking to build democracy picked a good keynote speaker, given the last 8 years that we have witnessed in Ghana. I don't know how much time I have, so for a bird's eye view, I would say that the Dr. Bawumia who delivered is not recognizable from the Bawumia operating in the last 8 years. He talked about democracy not being a do or die affair. But he was on the ticket in 2020 when 8 of our fellow Ghanaians died in elections, and he and his boss, the man whose saplanke he was, didn't say a word. He talked about strengthening institutions. He and his boss did a lot to hollow out our institutions. He quoted notable statesmen. Barack Obama said, Africa does not need strong men, it needs strong institutions. And I can say that Dr. Bawumia didn't contribute to strengthening institutions. They hollowed them out. He talked about nepotism in appointments. We have never seen worse nepotism in this fourth than under the government. And then he goes on to talk about the syndrome. That is actually a valid point. He quoted Mandela, but President Rawlings made that point more potently by saying that democracy is not just an abstract guarantee of rights. It also means food in your a roof over your head and clothes on your. It was actually more potent than Mandela in the way that he's. Another thing that he alluded to but didn't emphasize is that in addition to ordinary people feeling, quote unquote, the fruits of the, they also want their leaders to share their struggles. In other words, even if all of us cannot one day wake up and have 3 square meals a day, we want to see that our leaders have not overnight grown unexplainably rich while the rest of us are continuing to be poor, and that there is no distance between the lives we live and the leaders. And it goes to, in the end, the idea that politicians' actions must be consistent with what they say, because what he did looked like inviting a prostitute to go and give girls in a convent lectures on chastity. That's my mission.
Interesting thoughts. Dr. Osankwapo, as you reflect on this, just think about what Dr. Arthur Kennedy has said. He says, yes, we'll get into the issues, but having Dr. Bawumia go and give this speech is like inviting a prostitute to go to a convent and preach to them about chastity. He also says I don't know whether the Nigerians picked a good keynote speaker in light of what has happened in Ghana in the last 8 years. Your reflections?
You know, so Dr. Kennedy is right in terms of some of the deterioration that we've seen to the quality of Ghana's democracy over the last 8 years. I mean, anyone who has paid attention to more than just Afrobarometer, but if you look at other key governance and democracy indices, you do see some real challenges in our democratic architecture. But overall, though, the speech for me was a really good one because it highlights some key issues about this whole idea of democracy that has to be sustained, right? It's a conversation that needs to be sustained. I've often made reference to this piece all the way back in 2009, written by a gentleman called Giovanni Carboni, where he makes the argument that it was titled The Consequences of Democratization. And one of his central argument is, look, a time is going to come where citizens in these new democracies are going to ask, what are we actually getting from democracy beyond, you know, the key freedoms, right, which are just as equally as important. But he goes on then to say, citizens at some point are going to look at a broader balance sheet and say, but are we also getting other things? And that's the notion of this next meal, which is how well is democracy also delivering on the bread and butter issues, right? Because citizens want good schools, good health facilities. Citizens want jobs, you know, they want a living wage. And when those things are missing and they begin to tie it to the system of government in place, which is democracy, then you stand the risk of democracy losing its legitimacy that it has over other kinds of government. So for me, the core idea of the speech is an excellent one, and it's a conversation that we really need to have, because at some point, if that next meal is not coming, you have to start worrying about what happens to democratic stability and the consolidation that a lot of countries, at least within the sub-Saharan African context, are trying to build.
And Anaya, I'll take it from there. The next meal, you know, policy, or the next meal principle, as he espoused. Because I'm sure you've heard that saying that a time may come where the poor may have nothing else to eat but the rich. And guess what? In our context, the political elite are an integral part of what you would call the rich. What is your reflection on this vis-a-vis what he says as well, that the power of the people is an important pillar of democracy which must be respected for democracy to thrive? He admits the power of the people, but the people are disempowered because they are poor. What do you think?
So first off, I think that's a very important point that you raised there. And here I like to quote a scholar by name Claude Ake. And he talks about the democratization of disempowerment. That is what democracy has become. It is more of cosmetic democratization, facade democracy. Also because we have reduced democracy to the crude mechanics of power politics. And at the center of this crude mechanics of power politics is election. It's more of electoral democracy than institutional democracy. The institutions are supposed to work, but they are not working. All that we are interested in is the 4 years election that ensures the reproduction of the elites in power, but not transmitting the relevance of democracy to the ordinary citizen. Now, before I come to your point, I think it's important also to mention that it is this whole idea of electoral democracy, right? If you are looking at the past 8 years of this, I mean, the former government, I mean, the result was what happened in the massive turnout of vote. But also because Dr. Bawumia conceded, you know, it gives him that kind of reputation, you know, quote unquote. I think there are 9 or around 10 Afrobarometer reports tells us the last one tells us how on the African continent, I think the satisfaction from the practice of democracy has been reduced by a certain percentage point, I think by 5 or 4. True. So generally, people are not feeling the kind of impact they ought to feel, right, from the price of democracy. The problem has always been, do we have the electorate, the masses, that appreciate the electoral processes? And so they are able to reflect on what they need from their leaders and put their leaders on their toes in terms of accountability. Or these electorate have also bought into what we call the economy of affection, as said by Grant Hayden, to the extent that they are only interested in what they'll get temporarily in satisfying their basic needs, that ensuring that we are putting in leaders that are visionary in orientation. And so let's say we go through some birth pangs, economic birth pangs within 1 or 2 years, and then in the next foreseeable years ahead of us, we have a smooth ride. You understand? The electorate have been conditioned to the extent that, if you are listening to the full speech that was given by Dr. Bawumia, you would have found that he spoke about the elite as well as the electorate, because it takes two to tango. And the electorate also have a role to play in ensuring that you have a strong democracy. So are the masses or the electorate ready to put the government, leaders on their toes? We are seeing that happening elsewhere. We saw that in NSAS in Nigeria. We saw that in Kenya, the recent development that came up. We have seen the youth, by and large, becoming very interested in democratic practices. But to what extent, can they call that seismic change in democratic growth or governance that we want? Or they are just going to flow along the need for satisfying their interim, needs, while the visionary leaders out there are not giving, the chance to us. So I think, by and large, these are some of the nuances that we can look at. The fact that it takes two to tango. The elites must be put on their toes. But once again, for me, the interest has always been this, how do you call it? The fact that it's greed, once you are in power, winner takes all is what I'm looking for, the word I'm looking for. The winner takes all.
Zero-sum game.
The zero-sum game, and the need that once you are in power, that is the only means of world creation. And so the do or die affair, comes in. So I think these are some of the important nuances that, we can look at.
And speaking of those nuances, if I come to you, Prof, I don't know what you think, because he talks about the importance, how crucial the power of the people is in sustaining our democracy and making it thrive. But at the same time, you would realize, as some have said, that the same political actors who make promises will do everything possible not to empower the people, but to make the people subservient so that they can continue controlling the levers of power. How then does that reflect in the speech of the former vice president?
And I think what Dr. Bawumia does is to try to explain this, on the one side, elite consensus that drives politics in most African countries. The second is the notion of the people or the masses. And then we hear the usage of all kinds of other words. Citizenship, participation, transparency, accountability. But in all this, I think Bawumia makes a very good point that most politicians don't seem to recognize. That politics is about the voluntary participation of ordinary people whose voices matter, and that politics is also about providing public service goods. I think Dr. Arthur Kennedy was straight to the point. When you've been part of a government that basically has undermined every single institution in your country for 8 years, from the police service to armed forces to immigration to education to our disastrous foreign policy, then to come around preaching good governance. I'm not bold enough to use Dr. Arthur Kennedy's words about chastity and some other profession, but it becomes a little bit difficult to take.
Prof, are you saying Dr. Bawumia had no locus to go and say those things in light of what we had experienced in Ghana?
Almost zero locus, because he kept quiet and moved along and benefited from whatever system they had created. So, and that is why I'm saying probably this is an epiphany. He just say, hang on, was this what I was part of? But this is not who I am. That the true Bawumia believes in these things. But he needs to demonstrate that. But then he also talks about 8 coup d'etats, forgetting that coup d'etats just don't happen. It's when you've driven people to the very fringes of their survival. You've hollowed out institutions, and people don't have a choice. And the sanctity and sovereignty of the state has been sold on a silver platter. And people are just simply fed up. So we've seen how the 8 coup d'etats and attempted coups that he mentioned almost all took place when they were chair of ECOWAS. Totally clueless about what was happening elsewhere. Our only lack was that we have a decently highly educated armed force leadership who do not believe in using the gun anymore. Okay, so all the things that he talks about, the next meal syndrome is a deliberate policy of Africa's political elite to use it to control. Because when we are satisfied, we'll be able to demonstrate, to speak up, to challenge that authority that gives them this false notion that they are more important than us, that we should be driven off their roads. Dr. Bawumia knows that his government closed the political space for engagement, that for people who spoke up, we were consistently threatened with losing our jobs, our salaries were cut, we were intimidated on a daily basis, our bosses called and threatened. So for me, we need to fuse theory with praxis. We need to demonstrate that the words that we use are meant to transform lives. Institutions do matter, but I think all the panelists will agree with you that were we to go through every single institution the last 8 years, their functionality and effectiveness were reduced by probably 30–40%. And the Afrobarometer report points to some of the key institutions and their reduced levels of effectiveness. So it's good enough to talk, but delivery and using the power that you have come to beg yourself from ordinary people to transform their lives then becomes key. And it is that lacuna from rhetoric to implementation and deliverability that is hollowing out all this rhetoric around elections, democracy, and all that. But we have a short time because people are getting frustrated, the population is booming, and people want answers to their day-to-day challenges and not just rhetoric and arrogance and pomposity.
Let me come to Dr. Arthur Kennedy, taking off from where Prof landed. The former vice president then says one of the most important determinants of a flourishing democracy is the quality of institutions, just taking off from where Prof left off. And he talks about capable of guaranteeing rights, including property rights, and checking wanton abuse of power. Let's stay there for a moment, because when he talks about the 8 coup d'etats between 2020 and 2023, you must also look at what could be seen as constitutional coup d'etats. In Côte d'Ivoire, we had Alassane Ouattara do what he did when the former president, Nana Addo Akufo-Addo, was one of the big men, the leaders in ECOWAS, yet his friend did that, and I believe even at the 2020 inauguration was invited to join him as he was outdoored as president. How then do we balance these out, Dr. Kennedy?
The way we balance this out to tell truth.
All right.
As the Bible says, and we shall know the truth and it shall make. I mean, if Dr. Bawumia had added a sentence or two during his speech about, sometimes we all say these things, but when we are in power, we fail, and I'm sorry for what I did while I was in power over the last 8 years, I will be cheering him from the rafters. It will have been at least an acknowledgement, but as it is, his speech insults our intelligence. And the point you make about what Nado did as ECOWAS chair, when, for example, he went to Guinea to try and reverse the coup, when the president there had really do unconstitutional things. And I think that when you look at Ghana during his term, for example, removing the Auditor General blatantly, I didn't hear him say anything. The courts ruled so often in their favor that somebody like Papa had to complain about when one side wins too much. A lot of other things were done to institutions that really weakened the body politic. But before I want to comment on something, because I come back to me, the voters, I think he made a question about the electorate. I think that there are two ways of looking at the electorate. I think party primary voters have been corrupted, but the general election voters, to be honest, ought to be admired. I think that we are on them when we say that they are part of the problem. If you look at Ghana in 2000, 2008, and 2016, the ordinary voters went to the polls and voted decisively for change. Unfortunately, you can't vote for someone who is not on the ballot. And the delegates are not giving the general electorate good choices to vote for. That is part of our problem. And as for the role of the youth, it is unfortunate that our politicians, including Dr. Bawumia, our youth to toilets instead of technology. I want to see the day when the youth of our parties argue about technology and what do they call economic policies and others, rather than who will control toilets, who will storm mines, and who will go to galamsey pits to get shot.
Interesting. Very interesting thoughts there. I saw you, Doc, also nodding along and all of that. When the vice president, former vice president, laments the fragility, it's fragile, our democracy. And you must look at it in the context of, for example, the US and the assault on the Capitol building. The system ensured that things that had to be reversed were reversed. It's now that Trump has come into power again and granted some of them, pardon. Having listened to Prof and Doc, what then, on the back of this, do we have to start changing now?
So one of the points that Dr. Arthur Kennedy made is distinguishing between the general electorate and party delegates. And his point that the party primary and the corruption of party delegates is something that must be looked into, because
it's a big problem.
Ultimately, you don't tend to, quote unquote, get good. The general electorate is not presented with the kinds of choices that one would hope for. To address that, I have been thinking about whether expanding the electorate in party primaries to a full open primary would help. Because what I say is that,
what do you mean by
meaning every registered member of the political party gets to participate in the party primary. So if it's their presidential primary, so long as you're a registered member of the party, you get to vote in that primary.
But think of the logistics. If you're looking at some of these parties, you're looking at 2-3+ million Ghanaians.
I get that. Plus, for example, in parliamentary primaries, everyone who is registered with the party in the constituency gets to participate. Because my argument is that it may be much easier to buy a handful of delegates than it is to try and buy an entire electorate. I've had conversations with some of my friends who are deep in party politics, and one of the concerns they have raised is that you may also run the risk of your political opponents choosing your candidates for you. Because if you don't put in the right parameters, someone who is not a member of your party can find a way to pose as a member and participate in your primaries. It will be interesting to find out from the NDC what they learned from having open primaries for their MPs and then reverted to the delegate system.
Right.
I'll be curious to know what informed their decision to move to an open primary and then what informed their decision to revert to the delegate system for their parliamentary primaries. But it's one of the things that I think we can give serious consideration to address Dr. Arthur Kennedy's concern about the corruption of the primary system.
Nanayo, he speaks about the ambitions of individuals, aka politicians in this sense, not superseding that of the general interest of the people. But if you look at what he says about strengthening citizens' rights to vote, some citizens, in a bid to express their will, political will, lost their lives in 2020, lost their lives in 2024. So how then do we merge this? The right to vote is in our constitution, but at the same time, if you look at the politicians' ambitions, sometimes they don't align with the general will of the people, as we have seen time and again. For you, what then are the solutions moving forward?
Well, I think this is where once again, democracy thrives on constant nurturing. You know, in an environment where there is that avenue for democracy to thrive, there must be constant sensitization. It's one of the advocacy that civil societies take on. I think that the CDD is doing a good job at that. I think the electorate and the voters must rise above occasion and understand that as much as they have some rights, a certain amount of rights enshrined constitutionally, they must also know that democracy is not a do-or-die affair, or elections is not a do-or-die affair. Because at the end of the day, these politicians, have, once again, they have their personal interest. And if you don't take care, you lose your life, or you lose something you cherish so much while they continue to live their lives, lavishly. So I think that sensitization and awareness amongst the electorate to understand that at the end of the day, it is trying to put in place leaders with visions for the foreseeable, years ahead of us, and not necessarily for the interim. That they are seeking your vote, and they come with all these appealing messages, with all these gifts in hand, to appeal to you, and then you sell your vote to them. So I think that electorate, by and large, this sensitization, education, making them aware of the benefits of democracy, not necessarily politics of the belly, instant gratification that you are getting from these politicians, but going ahead, how you can put in place leaders, who think about the social well-being, the economic well-being of the whole country, and the policies that they put in place to ensure economic advancement or progression, and not necessarily, for the time being. So I think these are some of the things on the part of the electorate that the voter that, we can look at. Yeah.
And talking about leaders reminds me of PLO Lumumba, the Kenyan, big brain. In fact, I remember, before I call for something on him, I remember something he said. He says, in Africa, we keep electing hyenas, and then we act surprised when they eat up the sheep or consume the sheep. But you can't elect a hyena to protect sheep. It's not going to happen. But in light of the conversation we're having, I want us to pay attention, watch this bit that PLO Lumumba had to share some time back.
Read the story in the Bible, and I read about Jesus of Nazareth, and I wrap my mind about his humility, and I hear him many times saying that he did not come to be served, but he came to serve. Then I look at our leaders who, when they are seeking to serve us, and it's not only in South Africa, it is almost everywhere in the Bible, when they are seeking our support, they are humility personified. They kiss babies. They go to the ship-in. They drink from dirty cups. They walk on foot. They smile with us. They take photos with everybody. They discard their security, their humility personified. They speak the language that we want to hear. They do the things that they think we want to see them do. They delude us. They cheat us. And somehow we accept that they are leaders. But immediately they get what they want, or they have a reverse Pauline conversion. If they were Paul, they go back to being Sauls, and we can no longer recognize them. When you ring them, their phones are picked by somebody called a PA, whose only claim to fame that he is rude beyond measure. When you go to the offices, they no longer want to see you. When they are driving in the streets, their sirens scare you. While I suspect that those who discovered the siren meant that it should be used for good purposes, for them it is a badge of honor, and they harass us in the streets. They acquire things which they have not worked for. They want to be described as honorable even when they are horrible. These are the men that we have.
They want to be described as honorable even when the things they are doing are horrible. And which brings me to the point about leadership. Coming back to you, Prof, he talks about humility, coming to serve and not to be served, and the very things we've seen, even in our politics. They will lie prostrate for you. They will stir banku with a spatula. They will play cards with you. They will do all kinds of things, but momo power no nashe. How then do we sanitize? How then do we reconcile all of these bits that Dr. Bawumia talks about? You've said that likely it's an epiphany. How do we make the dream become real in our democracy? Prof.
It's about consistent, active engagement. It's about throwing their words back at them and saying, as a citizen, you can't, you mustn't, and I won't allow you. And it comes with a price. And I think Dr. Kennedy knows this. He's felt it on his body. What does the rules, or what do the rules in Ghana say about using siren? If there's no police motorcycle in front of you, then it's not an official motorcade. So I always tell my driver, stop in the middle of the road, don't move anywhere. Because that person using that siren does not have the right. And more often than not, they will rather get into the traffic. As citizens, we must stand up and be counted and feel the pinch of that contribution to deepening democracy on our own bodies. But more often than not, we want somebody else to do it and for us to reap the benefits. And I do understand those who are afraid. But there cannot be more frightened people unwilling to speak up in a state than bold ones. And for me, it's citizen participation and speaking up. And the price is high. You lose your job, you'll be transferred, your boss will be harassed to harass you, your company's GRA will use some tax measure to try to undermine your company. Some rules will be made to destroy you, your friends will be destroyed. So it comes with a price. And the last 8 years taught us that political activism has a price to pay, particularly when those who don't want your activity or your engagement also have a language that appeals to the wider international community. So getting your voice heard at the local level, getting the support and the sympathy that you need and the encouragement to continue can be very difficult. But it is work in progress. But we need that critical mass to be able to bring about that change. And it must start from the day every new set of people take over power. We cannot say, let's wait a little bit and give 6 months. 1 year. No, things were too bad, so let's give 2 years. No. That role to keep those who control power and the public purse in check is a constant daily engagement. And everybody can do it at every level at which he or she is. But political elites understand that when people are poor, when people are desperate, when people are ignorant, then you can throw little things at them, and that creates a sense of satisfaction. That reduces their determination to engage, to critique, and to contribute. But it must be a collective responsibility. The shift from 1 million votes in 2016, its reduction to 500,000, and the swing back to almost 1.3, 1.4 must send a clear message to the political elite. You can fool the people only so far. But the last laugh is always for the ordinary people that you took for granted.
Let me come to Dr. Arthur Kennedy on that then, because when Prof speaks about citizen participation, you remember the former president said we should be citizens, not spectators, which meant that we should voice out. But you remember in that demonstration where that young lady spoke up about, which started the conversation about kidney dialysis issues and all of that, she said she had lost her job because she had spoken up. If you put that side by side with, just going back briefly, to what the former vice president says about institutions and shoring them up, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the same people who speak about institutions are the same ones who work actively, assiduously, to undermine the institutions. Quoting him, he says, these institutions include the independent election management bodies, the judiciary, the ombudsman, the police, other law enforcement agencies. My curiosity, Dr. Arthur Kennedy, is that these same institutions he mentions, in Ghana, the Electoral Commission, now someone is taking on the Electoral Commission and its chairperson and deputy saying they did not work well. The judiciary, which has also been lampooned, the ombudsman. In Ghana, you could look at the OSP. All of these institutions have been seen maybe not to have lived up to our expectations. How do we reconcile, Doc?
Well, it's not that they have been seen maybe not to have lived up to their... they haven't. A lot of the leaders of these institutions have colluded with political leaders in undermining their own independence. There are, of course, exceptions like Domilovo as the Auditor General. I think, my friends, we are practicing democracy without democrats. You know, deep down, a lot of our political leaders want to win at all costs. And the extent that the points that have been made, the public being involved and active is concerned, the part that I agree with is that democracy is not just about voting. It is what you do in between voting. And I always refer to when Nanado decided to pay his wife and the vice president's wife, public anger shamed them into returning the money. I think that the public can help. Sometimes if you see someone, Professor from Boateng or Martin Amidu walking around the street, go to them and say, thank you for what you are doing for Ghana, because standing up to political bullying and ostracism and others has a very high price, and I can attest to that. I have a lot of scars. Sometimes your own lifelong friends in pursuit of power and trying to get their crumbs from the table stop talking to you because they think talking to you is dangerous to their careers. We cannot have a country like that. And I go back to saying the general electorate by and large is okay. Our problem is political party primaries, and we should open those up. The more we democratize them, the better. Actually, even in US here, there are political party primaries where sometimes you can go and register that same day for a party and vote. And yes, there might be some attempts by independents to affect your primary one way or the other, but no, that is not really the problem. It's just an excuse. Nobody can prevent the people of Bantuma and be parliamentary candidate. Nobody in, what do they call it, who can prevent the NDC from picking their own parliamentary candidate. Yeah, there might be something here and there at the margins, but we must trust the democratic process. We must increase transparency, and we must give people more power. I really admire the Ghanaian electorate. They've been trying to do the right thing. The problem is that the politicians keep getting in the way.
The politicians keep getting in the way. Doc, think about it. Dr. Arthur Kennedy says we are practicing democracy without Democrats, and that democracy is not just about voting, but what you do in between voting. Let me expand that to what the Constitution says about what we should all aspire to and what the leaders of our country should give us. But again, you would hear Professor Inning talk about the fact that in the end, we settle for crumbs because that is what we are offered. And instead of sitting at the table, when we are offered the crumbs, we're happy. At least we've got something. For you, what will it take to get not just the leaders, but we, the followers, to get to the right end?
So it appears that elections, we've gotten the election part of our, or at least it appears that the election part of our democracy is one of our strengths, in the sense that, so you have two very vibrant main political parties who have built elaborate structures that allows them to compete on a regular basis for the votes of Ghanaians. And the Ghanaian voter has also shown that if there comes a point where they are really dissatisfied with a particular political party, that they are able to use election as their main tool of accountability. But as has been raised, it has to be, the key is what you do between elections. But I think the reason why elections continue to be the main tool of accountability for the Ghanaian voter is that it is the most potent tool, right? So if I look at the results of the 2024 election, one of the things I say to myself is, it was as though the Ghanaian voter was saying, if our dissenting voices, if our cries, if our concerns would not be heard, if there's a price to pay for active citizenship, we won't say anything. We will just wait for that election day and demonstrate our dissatisfaction in very decisive ways through the ballot. But elections continue to remain very critical. One of the things that I have said to some of my colleagues is that maybe if we did it more frequently, right, that you don't wait even for that 8-year cycle we've settled in, that at the 4-year point where a party wants re-election, that maybe if we 3 elections later where everybody has only been given 1 term, my argument is that it may jolt the political class into realizing that, look, you can't keep taking the Ghanaian voter for granted, and that now they've even shortened your time from an 8-year to change to 4 years. The other part about active citizenship, for me, is not even the price that state institutions place on citizens, right? So how the police, for example, would respond when citizens want to protest. It is the price that our own fellow citizens place on us. People try to protest, And some of the rhetoric coming from their own fellow citizens make it sound as though if things go well, that it would only inure to the benefits of those who are protesting. And I think our fellow citizens must begin to ask themselves, do I want to put impediments in the way by whether it's my rhetoric, the kinds of things that I say about people who are protesting, because maybe you feel it's not politically advantageous to your side, that practice must be curtailed. But for me, those are some of the things on the citizen side that we can do to strengthen.
Very quick point. I want very brief thoughts on this. Active citizenship. Do you think if what Oliver Barker-Vormawor has said, for example, about, sometimes in our democracy, maybe some things may have to pass on before certain things are done. If somehow it can be proven that it is true, would that be active citizenship on his part? What he has said in recent times about members of parliament and the vetting committee. If there was some evidence to that, would that be active citizenship? Because he's putting his neck on the line, literally.
Precisely, and showing that something untoward. I mean, if he really has evidence, right? That's part of active citizenship, to be able to put into the public domain the things or the practices that are happening that may undermine, our institutions. But the quick point that I would also make is that I've also realized that our institutions are very resilient. And I don't know where that resilience comes from. The quick example is, last year, one of my Facebook memories showed that as far back as 2014, when the Afrobarometer Round 6 came out, I did a post on trust in the Electoral Commission. And 10 years later, in 2024, I was still writing about low trust in the Electoral Commission. So there's also a certain level of resilience that I'm not sure at this point how you even jolt these institutions to become a lot more responsive to the concerns of Ghanaians.
Nanayo, let's stay on the beat of citizens. We've been called to be citizens, right? Quoting Dr. Bawumia, he says, citizens need to play their part by holding duty bearers and political office holders to account. He's saying we need to play our part to hold them to account by bringing relevant facts and information and well thought through ideas and suggestions to the forefront of national discourse. In effect, the watchdog role of citizens, if devoid of misinformation, fake news, and partisan narratives, can go a long way to sustain a culture of democratic governance. My interesting question to you, did you see this? Let's use him as an example. In the 8 years when he was vice president, what are you hoping to see on the back of that in this new administration?
Well, I think the answer to your question probably lies in the outcome of the election results that we had. Personally, there are a lot of inadequacies. There are a lot of shortcomings within the 8 years governance that we saw under the Vice President and President Akufo-Addo, former President and Vice President. And I think that, like I said earlier on, maybe when parties are in opposition, they begin to see things clearly than they do when they are in power. But also importantly is how, and this reminds me of one of the many books that we read. There is a book by Shabal and Dalos, Africa Works, Disorder as Political Instrument. And the idea is that institutions in Africa, by and large, are deliberately undermined, by politicians. I mean, I'm not saying that is how things are, but they are saying that is how Africa works. Because when institutions work, they are devoid of personal sentiment. They are seen as public spaces that politicians cannot take as bona fide properties. They cannot make the state a prebendal right. And so it inures to their benefit to undermine these institutions. So at the end of the day, there's going to be that patron-client relationship for them to continue to dish out resources to their supporters, for them to reproduce them in power. So I think that there is some amount of responsibility, on the citizen to ensure that the politicians are held to their words once they are in power. And there is that constant engagement. That is why I said initially that democracy needs constant nurturing, constant sensitization. The people must be aware of the power that they have. You know, because it's the people that bring...
That's an important point.
Yes, the popular will of the people, the power that they have. You know, because at the end of the day, this is what the people have, the decision of the people against the MPP government. You know, in some places, they will say they show them their smoothness level. But the point I'm saying is that there is a massive popular will power that, you know, the voters have. And I think that once they understand, and this means rising above the occasion to understand democratic engagement and how democracy works. So you put it above just the politics of the belly and what we stand to get immediately. But then let the politicians know that we own them, we put them in power, so we have every right to ensure that the social contract against which we voted for them is fulfilled once they are in power. And that needs constant engagement. And like Prof said, it comes at a price. You know, when you call for the rains, you have to be ready to deal with the mud. And once these things are taken care of, I think that we will begin to see certain physical, real transformation in our lives, you know, as we expect from democratic dividends or the practice of democracy, so that we don't experience the kind of democratic recession that we are experiencing, you know, across the continent. Although I must state that by the Afro Barometer report, which is now, I think, 39 to 40 countries in Africa, there is that strong preference for, you know, democracy as against other forms of government, although there is some, you know, decline in its preference. Yeah.
But when you look at the countries, especially those in the Sahel that have gone the other way, you would see that the preference for democracy has fallen sharply. And in its place, the preference for militarism has taken effect, which means that as democracy erodes, the other side also takes over, which is what we don't do.
In fact, I don't mean to cut you, but even countries that are known for their democratic credentials, like Mauritius, like Botswana, even South Africa, you know, they are experiencing this democratic recession. And the reason has been that the government is failing to deliver on their promises. Look at the government of Jacob Zuma. You know, the Zondo Commission that came up with the horrendous amount of corruption cases against Zuma. And what happened to him? People are feeling that just a few people up there are amassing wealth. This is accumulation by dispossession. This is primitive accumulation of capital through democracy. So again, democracy has been weaponized as a tool of accumulation and dispossessing the masses, you know, from what they ought to benefit from its practices. So I think that by and large, the ordinary electorate, and Dr. Kennedy said that the ordinary Ghanaian electorate is doing well by his standard. But I think that we need to be ready to take on the government, let them realize that we have the power to put them in where they are, and that we have the power to ensure that they are held accountable for their practices and their actions.
Gentlemen, as I take your final thoughts, some takeaways from the conversation, it appears our leaders do know what is right, but for some reason, when they are in power, it appears they cannot do what they said they would. What can this current administration, like one of you pointed out, there's no time to waste. What can this current administration learn from this conversation we are having? And what will the future of Africa look like if these issues are not addressed going forward? I'll start with you, Professor Aning. Final words on this matter.
Well, first and foremost, I think the new administration must understand why and how they won and the expectations of the Ghanaian public. That the swing from 1 million negative votes that made them lose to almost 1.34 million plus shows that A, we've given a red card to the previous government and that we have some expectations of them. But we can only keep their feet to the fire when we start engaging them now, pointing out where they've fallen short of their own promises, how they can do things much better, and ensuring that the conversation is live. I have always said this, and for which I got a lot of flack. Under President Mahama, I've never felt any fear of intimidation, both to my personal life, my job, my family, and my friends. So I've always been able to speak. So I will encourage other people to speak. Because if we don't, and I think this comes to the last question about the future, what is happening in the Sahel is not because people love military dictators. It's because democracy failed to deliver on the social welfare. The interesting thing about the Sahel case is that it's opened other African countries' eyes to where most of their problems came from, France. So Senegal, La Côte d'Ivoire, Chad are all saying we need to rewrite our agreements with France, which is a major contribution to Africa's agency. I think the present president's appointment of a special envoy to the Alliance of Sahel States is a useful step in rebuilding trust between, yes, in rebuilding trust between Ghana and the AES states, because the former president deliberately attempted to carry favor with the United States by trying to sell Burkina Faso for a mess of politics, which was disgraceful and totally uncalled for. What has happened in the AES states, if you see the videos of the demonstrations, was about the anger of the youth or young people against the standard politics of the day. We saw the same shift in Senegal.
Right.
We've seen it in Liberia. Okay, we are seeing some uprisings across the sub-region. So the future for the continent is for more engagement, an inclusive, dialogic type of politics in which this elite consensus of lies, scratch my back, I scratch your back. If you leave power and you've looted some money, I'll talk a lot about it, but I won't punch you. It will not fly. Okay. Because there's a sense of impatience, of anger, of frustration. And as the rest of the world locks Africa out, we are going to stay here. It's going to become like a cauldron of frustrations. Eventually, it must have a certain outlet. For those who have not used a pressure cooker before, normally they will say after 4, 5, 6 whistles, then you can open the pressure cooker. We are on the 5th or so whistle before we have a social conflagration. Final point. Nana, I like your references to all these books that I probably read 80, 40 years ago. Chabal and Dallos, Africa Works. Let's ask them if they will write a similar book, USA Works. The same yardstick that they used to demean and to analyze and to critique. We are now seeing it happening in the United States. You know, and I think Dr. Kwapon's point about institutional resilience I find very interesting. But that resilience is because of the cyclical patterns of 8 year shifts and changes in the leadership that brings new energy, new ideas, new thought that allows these institutions to go on. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Interesting way to sum it all up. Dr. Kennedy, final thoughts.
Yes, I noticed that during the former Vice President of Nigeria, he talked ambition for personal ambition versus ambition for one's country. I actually frame ambition differently. Monet once said that there is a difference between ambition to be and ambition to do. Ambition to be is ambition to occupy positions for yourself. Ambition to do is ambition to achieve things for general society. And I think that when we talk about the problems, and I'm moving to the new government, the problems that we have, we talk about politicians and citizens. I think education is not as sharp as we might. A lot of technocrats and lesser known people who get appointed to head institutions. And I think that those people can strengthen our democracy by defending their institutions. Justice Aban refused to play along with Achampon and had to escape through a window. In the United States, the Defense National Security Advisor resigned rather than go along with Jimmy Carter's Iran episode. In Kenya, Ojinja Odinga resigned as president because he found some things wrong. I look for the day when an IGP would do what is right. For example, in the deaths of the 2020 citizens in election, by going after those who did that and say, damn the consequences. I look for the day when a chief justice, as indeed we've had in the past, people went against Nkrumah during things like the Kolungugu thing and got sacked. I look for days when citizens, when they are picked to head these institutions, will act in the national interest and defend these institutions.
Right.
Having said that, so I come to this government and say, all who have been appointed, your loyalty is to Ghana and not just to the president. Even a well-meaning president needs pressure and integrity around them. And I always, I know that people have been quoting books. I tell people the story of Fiorella LaGuardia, who was said to have been the greatest mayor of New York. People who don't know history think Rudy Giuliani is, but it was Fiorella LaGuardia. LaGuardia was a liberal and an activist, and he wanted to do something to help the poor. He didn't have the votes to do that, so he was trying to cut corners. And one of his friends wrote him a letter that said, Mr. Mayor, I know you have a good heart and you mean well, but good men in good times should not set bad examples for bad men, because what you do today will be cited as a precedent in future by men less honorable than yourself to do harm to our polity. Let us be principled. In the end, leadership is about character, having the same character in opposition and in government. And if you have that, then you wouldn't give the speech that we heard the president give after 8 years of being in government. And I say, whenever you are in doubt, sing Ephraim Amos Yanaraya Stasini and do right by Ghana. We have a great country, but only we can build it as leaders, as technocrats, and as citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll come into the studio. That's how we'll wrap. We have to make this bite-sized because of time. Dr. Kwapo.
Definitely. For the new administration, understanding the mandates that Ghanaians have given them and appreciating the fact that there are certain things that Ghanaians want and doing your best to deliver on some of those things. In terms of the future of Africa, we would have to continue to identify and respond to these threats to democracy. And that, for me, is the key things that we have to keep thinking about and working on.
Thank you so much. Nanaya, you have the final word.
Yes, I think everything boils down to social contract.
Right.
You know, the government was voted into power to execute certain specific policies or certain demands that the electorate wanted. I don't think it's any grandiose or out of anything so huge, mammoth, that they expect from the government, but basic things that will make their lives comfortable. A working environment is all Ghanaians are asking for. So I'm hoping that the president wants to leave a certain legacy because he's been in power before. And so he has the opportunity to right most of the wrongs that happened in the first tenure. And I hope that he really, and I wish him well, and I think he's going to do a good job with a list of appointments that he started already. So we can only hope the best for him and pray that he fulfills the social contract that the people put him up there to fulfill. And again, I'm hoping that there will be a time where African leaders will take on the mantle of some leaders we had some time ago, the President Kufuor, the Obasanjo, the Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, where African peers, African leaders, you know, their peers spoke to them. They spoke to power when things were going wrong. I'm hoping that we are going to see the certain kind of architecture to, as it were, you know, drive, you know, our democratic credentials up there, you know, some time to come. So this is the little that I have to say. Yeah.
Nanayao, thank you so much, and that's how we cap off the conversation. He said something brilliant, so we must hope they do the right thing. We must pray they do the right thing. I'll add, we must also prod them with the rod of accountability so that they do the right thing, like it or not. This has been a very insightful, it's one of the conversations I must say I have enjoyed. The plethora of intelligence and history that has been shared here. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Dr. John Osai Kwapong is a CDD fellow. He joined the conversation. We also had Nanaya Omreku, an African and international relations analyst. We had Professor Kwesi Enning, a security consultant providing bespoke services in risk assessment and forecasting. And of course, our very own Dr. Kobna Arthur Kennedy, physician and political activist. I cannot thank you enough, gentlemen. Yadamwase, Yamamwa Yuko. This is how we cap it off. Do stay with us. We'll be right back with more.